The throne room was built to intimidate. Ara had known that the moment she crossed its threshold an hour ago, passing beneath the carved stone wolves that flanked the entrance. Every surface gleamed with polished granite. Every pillar stretched toward a vaulted ceiling lost in shadow. The space swallowed sound and returned only echoes. She stood now in the center of that vast emptiness, hands steady at her sides, and met the gaze of the man who sat above her on a throne of black oak and iron, Alpha King Veyron. The bond hummed between them like a living wire. She felt it in her chest, in the base of her spine, in the pulse at her wrists. 3 years she had carried this secret. 3 years she had buried the moment it snapped into place and refused to let it rise. Tonight, she had been summoned. The letter had arrived at her pack's border settlement with the king's seal pressed into red wax. It had named her specifically. It had offered no explanation. She had known, of course. Somehow he had learned. Veyron leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his pale eyes fixed on her with an intensity that would have broken a weaker wolf. His dark hair fell across his brow, and the firelight from the great hearth painted sharp lines along his jaw, his throat, the broad plane of his shoulders beneath the black tunic he wore. He was beautiful in the way that dangerous things often were, controlled, unyielding. When he spoke, his voice filled the hall without effort. "You've known for 3 years." It was not a question. Ara inclined her head once. Her own voice came softer, but it did not waver. "Yes. And you said nothing." "I said nothing." A muscle tightened in his jaw. Around them, the hall seemed to hold its breath. She felt the presence of others, council members and guards stationed along the walls, but none of them moved. None of them spoke. "Why?" The word was clipped. "Controlled." But beneath it she heard the growl, low and simmering, the sound of a wolf straining against its tether. Ara let the silence stretch for 1 beat. 2. Then she answered. "Because you made it clear you wanted no mate." His eyes narrowed. "You presume to know what I want." "I heard what you said." Something flickered across his expression then, gone almost before she could name it. Confusion, perhaps? Or recognition? She took a single step forward, not close enough to challenge. Close enough to be heard clearly. 3 years ago, the border summit. You stood in the council tent after the signing, and your beta asked if you would consider taking a mate now that the territorial conflicts were settled. Her voice remained steady, though her pulse beat hard in her throat. You told him you would never bind yourself to someone from a lower pack. That strength had to be matched, or the bloodline would weaken. She watched his face carefully, saw the moment memory surfaced and locked into place. You said you had no intention of giving your heart to anyone who couldn't stand beside you as an equal. And you laughed. Veyron sat back slowly, his hand curled over the arm of the throne, knuckles white. You were there. I was part of my Alpha's delegation. Ara's throat tightened, but she did not look away. I felt the bond the moment you entered that tent. And I heard your answer 5 minutes later. For a moment, no one moved. The fire crackled in the hearth. Somewhere high above, a draft groaned through the rafters. Then, Veyron rose. He descended the 3 steps from the throne with the fluid grace of a predator, and every wolf in the room tensed. Ara felt the power rolling off him in waves, the undeniable weight of an alpha in his prime. But she had not come this far to flinch now. He stopped 3 paces from her, close enough that she could see the silver flecks in his pale gray eyes, close enough that the bond pulled taut between them, aching and insistent. You rejected the bond before I even knew it existed. I saved us both the pain of a bond you would have refused. That was not your choice to make. You made it first. The growl that left him was audible now, vibrating through the stone beneath her feet. She felt his wolf rise to the surface, felt the heat and rage of a mate denied. Around them, the council members shifted, uneasy. But Ara did not lower her eyes. "I came tonight because you summoned me," she said quietly. "But if you expect me to accept the bond now, after 3 years, after those words, you are mistaken." "You would reject your Alpha King?" "I would reject a man who sees me as lesser." The air between them crackled. His wolf was so close now she could see it in the dilation of his pupils, the tension in his shoulders, the barely leashed violence in the way he held himself still. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something rough and low. "If you reject me here, in front of my council, the bond will break." "I know. My wolf will not accept it quietly." "I know that too." Veyron stared at her for a long moment. She thought she saw something move behind his eyes, something almost like anguish, but it was gone before she could be sure. "Then say it." Ara drew a slow breath. She felt the bond thrumming in her chest, warm and insistent. The promise of everything she had ever wanted and everything she had taught herself to live without. She thought of the girl she had been 3 years ago, standing outside that council tent with her heart cracked open. She thought of the nights she had spent forcing herself not to dream of him. She thought of the choice he had made without ever knowing her name. And she spoke. "I, Ara of the Emberwood Pack, reject the mate bond." The words fell into the silence like stones into water. For one heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Veyron's head snapped back as though he'd been struck. His whole body went rigid. A sound tore from his throat, half snarl, half something broken, and the wolf in him surged. She felt it through the bond as it shattered, felt the severing like a blade drawn across her ribs. Her knees buckled, but she locked them, refusing to fall. Veyron staggered. His hands came up to his chest, clawed and shaking. Around them, the council members stepped back, eyes wide. Even the guards near the door shifted their weight, uncertain. When he raised his eyes to hers again, they were no longer human. The wolf looked out at her with pale fire and fury, and she knew in that instant she had made a terrible mistake. Not in rejecting him, but in believing she could walk away unscathed. His lips pulled back from his teeth. And then he moved. Ara spun and ran. She made it to the great doors before they slammed open ahead of her, and then she was in the corridor, her boots striking stone, her breath ragged in her chest. Behind her, she heard the shout of a guard, the scrape of claws on granite, the deep and terrible howl of a wolf who had just lost everything. She did not look back. She ran for the outer gate, for the forest, for the only safety she knew. But even as she fled into the night, she felt him behind her. Hunting. The forest swallowed her whole. Ara's boots slid on damp leaves as she plunged deeper into the darkness beyond the palace grounds. Her breath came in sharp bursts that clouded white in the cold air. Behind her, distant now but still audible, she heard the growl that seemed to shake the earth itself. He was coming. She had known he would. A rejected alpha's wolf didn't simply accept loss. It hunted. It raged. And if the bond had been strong, if it had been real, she pushed the thought away and ran harder. The trees here were old, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches woven so tightly overhead that even the moonlight struggled to reach the ground. Ara knew these woods. She had been raised in forests like this, had learned to track and hide and move without sound before she could write her own name. But this was his territory, and he was born to it. She veered left, following a narrow game trail that wound between two mossy boulders. Her heart hammered against her ribs. The pain from the severed bond still burned hot in her chest, a raw ache that made it hard to think clearly. She had done the right thing. She had. The memory rose unbidden, sharp and vivid as the night it had happened. 3 years ago. The border summit had been her first official delegation. She'd been 22, newly appointed to her alpha's inner circle, and desperately eager to prove herself. The Emberwood pack was small, but they were respected. Her alpha, Veyron, had been invited to witness the treaty signing that would end 2 decades of territorial conflict between the northern packs. Ara had stood in the back of the council tent, silent and observant, while the alphas signed the accord one by one. She had watched the proceedings with careful attention, noting every gesture, every shift in posture. She'd wanted to learn, to understand the politics that held their world together. And then he had entered. Alpha King Veyron. She had felt it before she saw him, a pull so sudden and fierce it stole the breath from her lungs. The bond snapped into place like a lock finding its key, and she had gripped the tent pole beside her to keep from staggering. He hadn't looked at her. He'd moved through the space with the easy confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair tied back, his pale eyes scanning the room with calm authority. He'd clasped arms with the other alphas, spoken a few words to the mediator, and signed his name in bold strokes across the treaty. And Ara had stood frozen, her heart pounding, her wolf rising inside her with a joy so overwhelming she thought she might break apart from it. Mate. The word had sung through every part of her. Mate. She'd barely heard the rest of the ceremony. Her whole world had narrowed to him, to the line of his shoulders, the sound of his voice, the way the firelight caught in his eyes when he laughed at something one of the northern alphas said. She had been about to step forward, to find some excuse to approach him, to meet his gaze, to let the bond make itself known. And then his beta had spoken. They'd been standing near the entrance, just outside the circle of alphas. Ara had been close enough to hear. Now that the peace is signed, the beta had said, his tone light, almost teasing, perhaps you'll consider taking a mate. The council's been asking. Veyron had smiled. It was not a kind smile. I have no intention of binding myself to someone from a lower pack, Davrin. Strength has to be matched. Anything less weakens the line. There are strong wolves in the lower territories. Strong enough to stand beside a king? Veyron's voice had been casual, dismissive. I think not. If I take a mate, she'll be someone who can hold her own in court and in battle. Someone who understands what it means to rule. Not some border wolf who'd be lost the moment she stepped into the capital. He'd laugh then, a low, easy sound, and Ara's heart had shattered. She'd left the tent before anyone could see her face. She'd walked into the forest and let the tears come in silence, her wolf howling inside her with a grief so deep it felt like drowning. By the time she returned to her pack, she had made her decision. She would bury the bond. She would never speak of it. She would live her life as though it had never existed. And for 3 years she had, until tonight. A branch snapped behind her. Ara's head whipped around, her eyes straining to pierce the darkness. The forest had gone quiet. No birds, no wind. Even the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush had ceased. She pressed herself against the trunk of a massive oak and forced her breathing to slow. Her wolf stirred uneasily, torn between the instinct to run and the instinct to turn and face him. She felt him before she saw him. The air changed, thickened. The scent of pine and smoke and something wild drifted toward her on a breeze that hadn't been there a moment before. And then she heard the footsteps. Not paws. Boots. He had shifted back. Ara's pulse spiked. A wolf she could evade. A wolf hunted on instinct. and she knew how to move through a forest without leaving a trail. But a man could think. She slipped around the far side of the oak, moving carefully, her steps soundless on the soft earth. Ahead of her, the land sloped downward toward a creek she remembered from the maps. If she could reach the water, she could mask her scent. She took 3 steps, and then his voice cut through the silence. "Ara!" She froze. He wasn't shouting. His tone was low, rough, edged with something that sounded almost like pain. "I know you're here." She pressed her forehead against the bark and closed her eyes. "I can feel you." That was impossible. The bond was broken. She had severed it herself. There should be nothing left between them but empty air. But even as she thought it, she felt the faint pull. Not the bond, something else. Something older and more primal. Recognition. "I'm not going to hurt you." Ara's hand curled into a fist against the tree. Her wolf snarled softly, confused and wary. "I just want to talk." She didn't believe him. Couldn't afford to. "Please." The word was so quiet she almost missed it. And it was that, his plea, raw and unguarded, that made her step out from behind the oak. He stood 20 paces away, half hidden in shadow. His tunic was torn at the shoulder, and there was blood on his knuckles. His hair had come loose and fell around his face in dark waves. But it was his eyes that held her. They were still wolf-bright, still edged with that pale fire. But the rage was gone. What she saw now was something far more dangerous. Confusion. Loss. "Why?" His voice cracked on the word. "Why did you run?" Ara's throat tightened. "You know why. I know what you said." He took a step forward, and she tensed. He stopped immediately, raising one hand as though to calm a spooked animal. "I know what you think you heard. But Ara, that was 3 years ago. Words don't change." "People do." She shook her head slowly. "Not that much. You don't know me. I know enough." His jaw clenched. For a moment she thought he might argue, might try to convince her with logic or authority or the sheer force of his will. But instead, he did something she didn't expect. He sank to his knees. The Alpha King knelt in the dirt before her, his hands open at his sides, his head bowed. And when he looked up at her again, his eyes were human. "Then let me tell you the rest." Ara's breath caught. She had not expected this. Not the plea, not the posture, not the stillness in him now, where moments ago there had been only fury. Her wolf circled restlessly inside her, uncertain. 3 years ago I spoke words I wish I could take back." His voice was steady now, though something rough edged each syllable. "But you're right. I said them. And I meant them. At the right time." She waited, her arms wrapped tight around herself against the cold. "I had a mate before you." The words hung in the night air between them. Ara's heart stuttered. She had not known, had never heard even a whisper of it. Her name was Elira. He looked down at his hands, at the dirt beneath his knees. She was the daughter of the high northern Alpha. Strong, brilliant, everything the council wanted for their king. We were bonded when I was 24. He paused, and Ara saw his throat work as he swallowed. "She died 2 years later. Childbirth." The world seemed to tilt beneath Ara's feet. She pressed one hand to the oak beside her for balance. The healers did everything they could, but the labor went on too long, and she was losing too much blood. And in the end, his voice fractured. "In the end, I had to choose, her or the child." Ara's eyes burned. She blinked hard against the sudden sting of tears. "I chose my son." The silence that followed was absolute. When Veyron looked up at her again, His face was raw with old grief. Taryn lived, a healthy boy with his mother's eyes, and I have spent every day since then trying to be the father he deserves, while carrying the weight of the choice I made. He rose slowly, his movements careful, as though he feared she might bolt again. The council wanted me to take another mate within the year. They said the boy needed a mother, that the kingdom needed stability. But I couldn't. He shook his head. I couldn't let anyone close, couldn't risk it, so I built walls and I told myself I was protecting him, protecting us both. Ara's voice came out barely above a whisper. And the words you spoke at the summit were a shield. He took one step toward her, then stopped. I knew if I made it clear I had no interest in bonding, the council would stop pushing. The delegations would stop offering their daughters. I could raise my son in peace and never have to face that kind of loss again. Her chest ached, not from the severed bond now, but from something deeper. You used cruelty to keep yourself safe. Yes. The admission was simple, undefended, and it worked. Until you. Ara closed her eyes. I didn't know the bond had formed that night. He continued quietly. I felt something when I entered that tent. A pull I couldn't name, but I'd felt echoes like that before. False starts, the healers said, were common after losing a mate. I learned not to trust them. He was closer now, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in the lines around his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly at his sides. 3 weeks ago, one of my scouts reported back from the Emberwood territory. He'd seen you at the border market, and he mentioned in passing that you'd been at the summit years ago. I didn't think much of it until that night, when I dreamed of you. Ara's eyes opened. I saw your face, heard your voice. And when I woke, I knew. His gaze held hers, unflinching. I sent word to every pack record keeper I trusted, asked them to search the old bond registries, the ones kept by the temple archivists. It took weeks, but they found it. A partial bond, formed, and then gone, quiet. I buried it, Ara said softly. I know! Something like admiration flickered in his expression. That takes extraordinary will. Most wolves can't suppress a bond that strong. It would have driven them mad. It almost did. The confession slipped out before she could stop it. Veyron's face softened. I'm sorry, he said, for the words I spoke, for the pain I caused without ever knowing your name. For every moment you carried that alone. Ara felt the tears slip free then, hot against her cold cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. I rejected you tonight because I couldn't bear to be chosen out of obligation, she whispered. Because I heard what you said, and I believed you saw me as something lesser, something not worth the risk. You were never lesser. His voice was fierce now, edged with something that made her wolf lift its head. You are the bravest person I have ever met. You stood in my hall and spoke truth to a king. You carried a broken bond for 3 years and built a life anyway. You are everything I didn't know I needed until the moment you walked away. She couldn't speak. Her throat had closed around the words. But I won't ask you to accept me now, Veyron said quietly. Not after what I've done. Not until you believe it's real. Ara's chest hitched on a breath that was half laugh, half sob. Then what do you want? He studied her for a long moment, and she saw the calculation in his eyes, the careful weighing of a man who had learned to guard his heart. Let me offer you something else, she frowned. My son needs a tutor, someone patient and kind, someone who understands what it means to grow up in the shadow of loss. His gaze didn't waver. The last 3 tutors couldn't reach him. He's 8 years old and he barely speaks. He stays in his rooms and draws pictures of his mother and refuses to let anyone close. Ara's heart twisted. I'm not asking you to be his mother, Veyron continued, or my mate. I'm asking you to come back to the palace. To try. To let me prove that I've changed, and to give Taryn a chance to know someone who isn't afraid of grief. You want me to come back, after everything that just happened? I want you to choose." His voice was soft now, almost gentle. Not the bond, not obligation, just a chance. Ara stared at him, at the man who had knelt in the dirt and bared his wounds without flinching, at the alpha who had hunted her through the forest and then stopped the moment she asked for truth. Her wolf stirred, quiet now, watching. "If I come back," she said slowly, "it's not as your mate. I know. And if I find you've lied to me, if this is just another way to bind me to you, then you walk away, and I won't stop you." She searched his face for deception, for manipulation, for any sign that this was a trap. All she saw was exhaustion, hope, and something fragile that looked almost like trust. 1 month, she heard herself say. "I'll stay for 1 month. I'll meet your son. I'll try." Relief broke across his features like sunrise. 1 month, he agreed. Ara took a shaky breath and stepped forward, not close enough to touch, but close enough that the space between them felt less like a battlefield and more like a question waiting for an answer. "Tell me about him," she said quietly. "Tell me about Taryn." And there in the forest, as the first light of dawn began to soften the edges of the sky, Veyron told her about the boy who drew wolves in charcoal and refused to cry, and Ara listened, and something old and wounded inside her began, slowly, to unfurl. They walked back through the forest as the sun rose, not side by side, but close enough that Ara could hear the rhythm of his breathing. Veyron spoke quietly, his voice steady now, telling her about the boy who had been born in the space between one heartbeat and a final breath. Taryn had been small, he said. Too small. The healers had worried he wouldn't survive the first night. But he had. He'd fought for every breath with a stubbornness that Veyron recognized as his mother's gift. And when they'd finally placed the child in his arms, wrapped in soft wool, and still red-faced from crying, Veyron had made a silent vow that he would give this boy everything he had left. He didn't speak until he was almost 3. Veyron said, stepping over a fallen log. The healers said it was normal, that some children took longer. But I think he was listening, watching, trying to understand a world that had taken his mother before he ever knew her. Ara's throat tightened. She thought of her own childhood, her mother's hands braiding her hair by the fire, her father's laugh echoing through their small cabin. She had grown up surrounded by warmth and noise and love. This child had grown up with silence and loss. "What does he like?" she asked softly. Veyron glanced at her, and something in his expression eased. "Drawing. He's always drawing. Wolves, mostly. Sometimes trees or mountains. He has a talent for it, the kind that makes you stop and look twice." He paused. "And he likes stories, not the ones from books. He wants the old ones, the kind passed down through generations. Myths about the first wolves and the moon and why we shift." "Does he shift yet?" "No." Veyron's voice tightened slightly. "Most children his age have shifted at least once. But Taryn, he won't, or can't. The healers aren't sure which." Ara heard the worry beneath the words. A wolf who couldn't shift was vulnerable, incomplete. It was rare, but not unheard of, and it almost always meant something had gone wrong in the bonding between human and wolf. Has he tried? Once. 2 years ago. He was in the courtyard, and one of the guards shifted to play with him, And Terran got so excited Veyron's jaw worked. He started to. I saw the change begin, but then he looked at me, and I think he saw the fear on my face, and he just stopped, pulled it back. He hasn't tried since. You were afraid he'd be hurt. I was afraid I'd lose him too. The admission hung between them, raw and unguarded. Ara understood then. The walls Veyron had built weren't just around his heart. They were around his son, around the one fragile, precious thing he had left. And he was asking her to step inside them. They emerged from the forest onto the palace grounds as the morning bells began to ring. The sound echoed across the stone courtyard, clear and bright. A handful of early risers moved through the space, servants and guards beginning their day. Several of them stopped when they saw their king. Ara felt their stares, the weight of curiosity and confusion. She knew what they saw. The Alpha who had stormed out of the throne room in a rage returned now with the woman who had rejected him, both of them dirt-stained and weary. Veyron didn't acknowledge them. He led her through a side entrance, down a corridor she hadn't seen the night before. The stone here was warmer, the walls hung with tapestries that softened the echoes of their footsteps. His rooms are in the east wing, Veyron said quietly, away from the noise of the court. He likes the quiet. They climbed a narrow staircase and emerged into a hallway flooded with morning light. Tall windows lined one side, looking out over a garden that was still green despite the cold. Ara glimpsed a fountain, a stone bench, rows of late-season roses. Veyron stopped before a heavy wooden door. "He'll be awake," he said. "He always wakes with the sun." Ara's pulse quickened. She smoothed her hands over her tunic, suddenly aware of how she must look. Her braid had come half undone during the night. Her boots were caked with mud. There were leaves caught in her sleeves. Veyron seemed to read her thoughts. "He won't care what you look like," he said gently. "He'll only care if you're kind." He knocked once, soft and steady. For a moment there was no answer. Then a small voice came from within. "Come in." Veyron pushed the door open and stepped aside, letting Ara enter first. The room was larger than she'd expected, but it didn't feel empty. One wall was lined with shelves filled with books and carved wooden animals. Another held a low table covered in parchment and sticks of charcoal. A fire burned in the hearth, filling the space with warmth. And in the center of it all, seated cross-legged on a thick rug, was a boy with dark hair and serious gray eyes. Terran. He looked up as they entered, his small hands stilling over the drawing he'd been working on. His gaze moved from his father to Ara, and she saw the question in his expression. Veyron crossed the room and knelt beside his son. His movements were careful, tender, and Ara's chest ached at the sight of it. "Terran," Veyron said softly, "I want you to meet someone." The boy's eyes returned to Ara. He didn't speak. Ara took a slow breath and stepped forward. She stopped a few paces away, and then, following some instinct she didn't question, she knelt as well. Now they were at eye level. "Hello, Terran," she said quietly. "My name is Ara." He studied her for a long moment. She saw intelligence in his gaze, and caution, and something that looked like loneliness. "Are you here to teach me?" he asked. His voice was soft, almost shy, but there was a steadiness beneath it that reminded her of his father. "I'd like to," Ara said. "If that's all right with you." Terran glanced at Veyron, then back to her. "The other teachers left." "I know." "They said I was too quiet." Ara's heart twisted. "I don't mind quiet," she said gently. "Some of the best people I know are quiet." Terran's brow furrowed slightly, as though he were weighing her words. Then he looked down at the drawing in front of him and carefully turned it so she could see. It was a wolf. rendered in charcoal with strokes that were far too skilled for a child his age. The wolf's head was lifted, its eyes fixed on something beyond the edge of the page. There was something achingly lonely about it. "This is beautiful," Ara said, and she meant it. Taryn's cheeks colored slightly. "It's my mother." The words were so simple, so matter-of-fact, but Ara heard the weight beneath them. "She must have been very strong," Ara said softly. "My father says she was the strongest wolf he ever knew." Ara's gaze flicked to Veyron. He was watching his son with an expression so full of love and pain that she had to look away. "I think she'd be very proud of you," Ara said. Taran tilted his head, considering. "Do you draw?" he asked. "A little. Not as well as you." "I could teach you." The offer was tentative, hopeful, and Ara felt something crack open inside her chest. "I'd like that," she said. Taran nodded once, a small decisive movement. Then he picked up a stick of charcoal and held it out to her. Ara took it, her fingers brushing his, and for the first time since she'd entered the room, the boy smiled. It was a small smile. Fleeting. But it was real. Behind them, Veyron let out a slow breath, and Ara felt his wolf finally settle. Not the rage and grief that had chased her through the forest, not the desperation of a bond denied, just peace. She sat down on the rug beside Taran, the charcoal warm in her hand, and when he pushed a clean sheet of parchment toward her, she began to draw. The charcoal moved across the parchment in hesitant strokes, leaving smudges where Ara's hand had rested too long. She was drawing a tree, or trying to. The trunk leaned slightly to the left, and the branches looked more like broken fingers than anything that might hold leaves. Taran watched her with solemn attention, his head tilted in that considering way he had. "The branches need to curve," he said softly, like they're reaching for something. Ara adjusted her grip and tried again. This time the line flowed a little smoother. "Better," Taran said, and there was no judgment in his voice, just patience. They had been sitting this way for nearly an hour. The morning light had shifted across the floor, warming the rug beneath them. Veyron had left after a few minutes, murmuring something about council meetings, but Ara had felt his reluctance in the pause before he closed the door. He hadn't wanted to leave his son with her, not yet, not until he was certain. She understood that, trusted it even. "My mother used to draw trees," Taran said suddenly. His eyes were still on the parchment, but his voice had gone quieter. "My father told me. He said she'd fill whole pages with forests when she was thinking." Ara's hand stilled. "Do you have any of her drawings?" Taran shook his head. "They were lost. In the fire." "Fire?" "After she died." His small fingers traced the edge of his own wolf drawing, careful not to smudge the lines. "My father burned everything in their room. He said he couldn't look at it anymore." Ara's chest tightened. She set the charcoal down and turned slightly so she could see his face. "That must have been very hard," she said gently. "For both of you." Taran nodded. He didn't look up. "Do you miss her?" Ara asked. "Even though you didn't know her?" The boy was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "I miss the idea of her. Does that make sense?" "Yes," Ara said, and her throat ached. "Yes, it does." Taran finally met her eyes. His were the same pale gray as his father's, but there was something older in them. Something that shouldn't have lived in a child's gaze. "The other tutors wanted me to forget," he said. "They said I should think about the future. About being strong. About making my father proud." He paused. "But I don't want to forget something I never had." Ara reached out slowly, carefully, and rested her hand over his small one. "You don't have to forget," she said. And you don't have to be anything other than what you are right now. Taryn stared at her hand covering his. Then, very slowly, he turned his palm up and curled his fingers around hers. They sat that way for a while, the fire crackling softly, the morning deepening into warmth. Finally, Taryn spoke again. "Will you stay?" The question was so simple, so full of hope. Ara's heart twisted. "For a while," she said honestly. "I promised your father I'd try." "He needs someone too," Taryn said. "He pretends he doesn't." "But he does." The observation was startling in its clarity. Ara found herself looking toward the door, as though she might see through it to wherever Veyron had gone. "Why do you think that?" she asked carefully. Taryn shrugged, a small lift of his shoulders. "He's lonely. I can feel it. Like there's a space inside him that nothing fits into anymore." Ara closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, the boy was watching her with that serious, considering expression. "You feel lonely too," he said. "It wasn't a question." Ara let out a slow breath. She could have deflected, could have turned the conversation back to drawing or lessons or anything safer. But this child had already seen too much dishonesty, too many adults who tried to protect him by hiding the truth. "Yes," she said quietly. "I do." "Because of my father?" She hesitated, then nodded. Taryn's brow furrowed. "Did he hurt you?" "Not on purpose," Ara said, "but yes, in a way." "He hurts himself too," Taryn said. "I think that's worse." The simplicity of it cut straight through her. She thought of Veyron kneeling in the dirt, his voice breaking over old grief. She thought of the walls he'd built and the price he'd paid to keep them standing. "You're very wise," she told Taryn softly. "Do you know that?" He shook his head. "I just pay attention. That's what wisdom is." Taryn smiled then, small and fleeting, and Ara felt something in her chest ease. "Will you teach me something?" he asked. "What would you like to learn?" "How to be brave." Ara's breath caught. She studied his face, the earnestness in his eyes, the way his small hand still held hers. "Why do you think you're not brave?" she asked gently. "Because I can't shift." The words came out in a rush, as though he'd been holding them for a long time. "All the other children can, even the younger ones. But I try and nothing happens. And I think my wolf doesn't want me." "Oh, Taryn!" Ara shifted closer, her voice low and fierce. "That's not true. Your wolf is part of you. It will always want you." "Then why won't it come?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "But I know it's not because you're not brave. Bravery isn't about shifting or fighting or being strong. It's about showing up even when you're afraid. It's about letting people see you when it would be easier to hide." Taryn's eyes searched hers. "Is that what you did? Last night?" Ara blinked. "What do you mean?" "My father told me you came to the palace even though you were scared, and that you said something true even though it was hard." Her throat closed. She hadn't realized Veyron would talk to his son about what had happened, hadn't considered that the boy might understand more than anyone expected. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's what I did." "Then you're brave too." The word settled over her like a benediction. She squeezed his hand gently. "We can be brave together," she said. "How does that sound?" Taryn nodded, his small face serious. "I'd like that." The door opened quietly, and Veyron stepped inside. He paused when he saw them sitting together, hands linked, the drawings spread between them. Something moved across his face. Relief, perhaps, or gratitude. Ara met his eyes, and for the first time since the bond had snapped, she didn't look away. "Council finished early," Veyron said. His voice was carefully neutral, but she heard the question beneath it. "Is everything all right?" She nodded once. Taryn released her hand and stood, crossing to his father with the easy trust of a child who had never doubted his parents' love. "She's going to stay," Taryn said, looking up at Veyron, "and she's going to teach me things." Veyron's gaze remained on Ara. "Is she?" "Yes," Ara said quietly. She rose to her feet, brushing charcoal dust from her hands. "If you'll have me." "The room beside Taryn's is empty," Veyron said. "It's yours for as long as you need it." "Thank you." The words felt too small for what was passing between them, but they were all she had. Veyron looked down at his son and rested a hand on the boy's dark hair. "Why don't you show Ara the garden before lunch? She should know where the rose path is. Your mother planted it." Taryn's face brightened. He turned to Ara, suddenly animated in a way she hadn't seen before. "Will you come?" "I'd love to," Ara said. The boy grabbed her hand again and tugged her toward the door. Ara followed, glancing back once at Veyron. He stood framed by the firelight, watching them go, and in his eyes she saw something that looked almost like hope. The garden was quieter than Ara had expected. The stone path wound between rows of late roses, their blooms heavy and dark in the cool air. Taryn walked ahead, his small hand still holding hers, his steps light and careful as though he were afraid to disturb something sacred. "She planted these the year before I was born," he said softly. "My father told me she wanted me to have something beautiful to see when I was old enough to walk." Ara felt her chest tighten. She looked down at the roses, their petals deep crimson fading to black at the edges. They were winter roses, the kind that bloomed even as the first frost came. Hardy. Resilient. "They're lovely," she said. Taryn stopped beside a stone bench that had been placed beneath an old oak. The tree's branches spread wide overhead, bare now but strong. He let go of her hand and climbed onto the bench, settling cross-legged with his back against the armrest. "This is where I come when I need to think," he said. Ara sat beside him, leaving space between them but close enough that she could feel his warmth. The garden stretched before them, quiet and still. Somewhere in the distance, she heard the low murmur of voices from the palace. But here, it felt like they were alone in the world. "What do you think about?" she asked gently. Taryn tilted his head back, looking up through the bare branches. "Everything. My mother, my father, why I can't shift." He paused. "Sometimes I wonder if she's watching. If she knows who I am." Ara's throat ached. "I think she does." "How do you know?" "Because love doesn't end," Ara said quietly. "Even when someone is gone, it stays. In the things they planted, the words they spoke, the way they shaped the world before they left it." Taryn was quiet for a moment. Then he looked at her, his gray eyes serious. "Do you think my father loved her?" The question caught her off guard. "Of course he did." "He never talks about her," Taryn said. "Not really. He tells me facts, things she did or liked. But he never tells me how he felt." Ara thought of Veyron kneeling in the forest, his voice breaking over the choice he'd had to make. She thought of the way he'd burned his mate's belongings because he couldn't bear to look at them. She thought of the walls he'd built to survive his grief. "Sometimes love is so big it's hard to put into words," she said carefully. "And sometimes talking about it hurts too much. That doesn't mean it isn't there." Taryn nodded slowly. "I think he's afraid." "Of what?" Of losing me too. The simplicity of it took her breath away. This boy saw everything, understood everything, and he carried it all with a grace that made her want to weep. I think you're right, Ara said softly. They sat in silence for a while, the cold air settling around them. Ara pulled her cloak tighter and watched the light shift across the roses. She thought about the month she'd promised. 4 weeks to try, to see if this fragile, broken thing between her and Veyron could become something real. She thought about the bond that had shattered and the space it had left behind. Not empty, just waiting. Ara? Taryn's voice was small. Yes? Will you tell me about your family? She turned to look at him. His face was open, curious, without the wariness she'd seen earlier. He wanted to know her, not as a tutor or a stranger who'd wandered into his life, as a person. My parents live in the Emberwood territory, she said. My father is a tracker. My mother makes medicines from the plants she grows. I have 2 younger brothers who are probably driving them both to distraction right now. Taryn smiled at that. Do you miss them? Every day. Why did you leave? Ara hesitated. The truth was complicated, painful. But this boy had trusted her with his own grief. She owed him honesty in return. I needed distance, she said quietly, from something that hurt me, and I thought if I could just be somewhere else, it wouldn't hurt as much. Did it work? Not really. She looked down at her hands, but it taught me something important. What? That running doesn't fix anything. It just gives you time to figure out what you're really running from. Taryn considered that, his small face thoughtful. Is that why you came back? To the palace? Yes, Ara said. I think so. I'm glad you did, Taryn said simply. The words settled over her like warmth. She reached out and rested her hand on his shoulder, a gentle weight. I'm glad too. They sat together as the sun climbed higher, and Ara felt something shift inside her. Not the bond. That was still broken, still raw, but something quieter. A sense of belonging she hadn't expected. A recognition that maybe this place, these people, could be more than she'd allowed herself to hope for. Footsteps sounded on the path behind them. Ara turned and saw Veyron approaching, his hands tucked into the pockets of his long coat. He moved carefully, as though afraid to intrude. Lunch is ready, he said when he reached them. If you're hungry. Taryn slid off the bench and looked up at his father. Can Ara eat with us? In our rooms? Veyron's gaze shifted to Ara. She saw the question there, the uncertainty. If that's all right, she said quietly. Of course. His voice was steady, but she heard the relief beneath it. Taryn grabbed her hand again, pulling her to her feet. Come on, cook makes the best stew. Ara followed, Veyron falling into step beside them. They walked back through the garden in a silence that felt almost comfortable, and when they reached the palace doors, Taryn didn't let go of her hand. They ate in Taryn's sitting room, the 3 of them gathered around a low table near the fire. The stew was rich and warm, filled with root vegetables and tender meat. Taryn chattered between bites, telling Ara about the books on his shelf and the wooden animals his father had carved for him when he was small. Veyron listened more than he spoke, his eyes moving between his son and Ara with an expression she couldn't quite name. Gratitude, perhaps. Or something deeper. When the meal was finished, Taryn yawned and leaned against his father's side. Veyron's arm came around him automatically, a gesture so natural, it made Ara's chest ache. Time for a rest, Veyron said gently. Taryn nodded, his eyes already heavy. He looked at Ara. Will you be here when I wake up? Yes, Ara said. I promise, satisfied. The boy let his father lift him and carry him toward the adjoining bedroom. Veyron glanced back once, his eyes meeting hers, and she saw the question there. "Stay," she nodded. When he returned a few minutes later, Terran settled and sleeping, Veyron closed the door quietly behind him. He stood there for a moment, his hand still on the latch, as though gathering his thoughts. "Thank you," he said finally. "For what?" "For keeping your promise." He turned to face her, and the firelight caught in his eyes. "For giving him something I couldn't." "What's that?" "Hope." Ara's breath caught. She looked at him across the small room, at the exhaustion in the lines of his face, the way he held himself so carefully, as though one wrong move might shatter the fragile peace they'd found. "He's a remarkable child," she said softly. "He is." Veyron's voice was rough. "And he deserves better than a father who's too afraid to let anyone close." "You're not afraid anymore." "I'm terrified." The admission was quiet, honest. "But I'm trying." Ara crossed the room slowly, stopping a few paces away, close enough to see the gold flecks in his gray eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him. "So am I," she said. Veyron's gaze held hers, steady and unflinching. And in that moment, standing in the firelight with his son sleeping in the next room, Ara felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in 3 years. Not the bond. That was still broken, still waiting. But the beginning of trust. The first fragile thread of something that might, one day, become whole.